Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn, Unit 3. I'm looking forward to working with you today. I just want to do the normal sound check before we go any further. Could I ask you please to just go to the question box there and just type in clear, just so that I know that I'm being heard. Otherwise, good. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Desiree. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, good. It sounds like I'm being well heard, which is great. As usual, of course, you'll receive the video, the recording of this presentation at the end, and you'll also receive the slides. So just relax and enjoy the process. All right. So let's get underway. There's the 6 modules that we have either covered or will cover over the next several weeks. And just going back, you'll recall we looked at the ingredients of effective feedback. So I'm hoping you're still continuing to do that wherever possible in your workplace, particularly positive feedback. And we did the influencing capabilities profile, and the last session was really about improving influence. And I'm hoping that you're consciously making an effort to change your influencing style and approach in accordance with the situation you're in and the people you're dealing with. So today we're going to look at optimizing team performance, which we'll cover shortly, of course, and then I'll talk about the others at the end of the presentation today. Okay, so I would suggest to you all that your primary role as a leader is to get the very best from each member of your team. Now, many people would have perhaps different definitions of what their role is, but I would suggest to you that that's a primary role. So there may well be other roles, but getting the best out of the people of each person that you lead in your team. Now, the heartening thing about this is that if you could measure people's productivity and said that this person here was at 60%, and this person here was at 40%, and this person here was at 80%, the key for you is to try to get them to perhaps improve their efficiency and effectiveness by, say, 10%. So the 40% person goes to 50, the 60 to 70, the 80 to 90. Now, if you could do that, which might seem on the outside to be a fairly small change, it would make a significant difference overall to your team. So this is not about getting people up to your very high standards. It's more around getting them to a point where they're improving in terms of their own efficiency and effectiveness. So I just want you to think about that for a moment before we launch into some ways and means about optimizing team performance. So there's 3 things essentially that we're actually going to look at today. We're going to consider some of the barriers around performance. We're going to consider a concept called the 5 conversations framework, and we're going to look at how you might be able to implement that. So I think one of the key themes out of today's session is very much around conversation skills. And I'm not talking about chit-chat in the hallway. I'm very much talking about the ability for you to have a good, constructive conversation with each of your team members as a means or a vehicle for you to improve their particular performance. So I'm going to share with you some of the conversations. In fact, during this session, I'm going to share with you 10 conversations that you should be having with your team members. And you can pick whichever of those conversations you think are relevant, and you can go ahead and do that. All right, so look, let's look at some statistics to start with. So let's look at some feedback around what other people might be saying about management. So here's a starting point, and it's a fairly sobering statistic. 79% of organisations worldwide are struggling to engage and retain their employees. Now, what Deloitte's have, just to qualify that information, is that we're talking about people that the organisation wants to retain. Because there are some people, of course, the organisation doesn't want to retain. And it reminds me of a wonderful saying: the only rats that leave a sinking ship are those that can swim. So therefore, the ones that are very capable will often be the ones that you want to hold on to, but obviously have options of leaving. And that's what that statistic is actually talking about. 86% of organisations believe they don't have an adequate leadership pipeline to address these problems. So not only have they had problem retaining their good people, they're also arguing that they don't have the necessary leadership wherewithal to be able to keep those people in the organisation. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is very much around the power of the conversation as a means of getting the best out of each of your team members, and ultimately being in a retention and attraction strategy, more a retention strategy than an attraction strategy. Okay, now look at this statistic. 90% of leaders rely on their own ideas rather than seeking involvement from their team. Worse still, 89% of leaders fail to listen or respond to the interpersonal cues from those they interact with. So this is the perceptions that team members or employees have of their bosses, and it probably suggests that we could be far more collaborative in the way we work with people. That often what happens is that we rely on our own ideas to the detriment of others' ideas, and often our ideas aren't necessarily the best ones. So I don't suppose that would necessarily surprise you, but you might want to think about your own circumstances there. Do you give people the opportunity of contributing their ideas? Disturbingly, only 5% of leaders are effective in building trust in their interactions with team members. Only 5% are effective in building trust in their interactions, which basically means that 95% of people are ineffective. So it's really important that in fact, the only way that you or me or anyone is going to build trust with other people is one conversation at a time. So what that means is that the only way, we can't do it via email, we can't do it via meeting, we have to do it one conversation at a time. So what this implies is that people aren't having enough conversations in their workplace. 60% of employees feel that their self-esteem has been dented by their managers at work. These people would rather do almost anything else than sit through a performance conversation with their boss. Now, that doesn't mean they don't need a performance conversation. It's saying that they don't want to, probably because of the way the manager is actually imparting that information. Although they did acknowledge, and this is where it is positive, they did acknowledge that a good boss with excellent interaction skills would enhance their productivity by as much as 60%. All right, so it leaves a lot of room for improvement in terms of the way we lead our team members, certainly. So, look, the other thing I'd say to you, if you've got questions, comments, observations, the normal process, just type them in the question box on the right-hand side. I'll keep an eye on it. And if in any stage during the presentation I see a question there, I'll stop and respond to it. Bear in mind, of course, that I'm the only one that actually sees your question. No one else does. All right. 79% of employees who quit their job cite a lack of appreciation as the reason for leaving. 79%. So what I'm doing here, I guess, is painting what probably is a very bleak picture about the lack of leadership skills in developing team members. Okay, and I guess it's important for us to understand that this is this is reputable research that I'm sharing with you, but it's significantly, well, it's certainly not good, and it certainly could be a lot better. 65% of North Americans report that they didn't receive any recognition in the previous year. Now, I understand that what people define as recognition may not be the same as what others might define it, but the very fact that we've got 65% of people saying, nope, I've received none in the last 12 months, would suggest, at the very least, that we're not giving enough recognition. We're not giving enough appreciation. We're not being authentic enough. We're not listening to people's ideas. All right, there's a lot of things in these statistics that need to be certainly fixed, if you like. So let's talk about conversations. And I want to just share with you some of the concepts around conversations that I think are very, very important. Because, of course, when I mention the word conversation, it can have all sorts of connotations as well. So the first thing I would say to you is that you can conceptualize organizations as conversations. How so? Well, every day in your organization, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, or even tens of thousands of conversations that go on every day in your organization. Some are task focused, some are people focused, some are trivia, some are long, some are short, some are interesting, some are not interesting, some are meandering, some are structured. We have conversations everywhere. And so you could argue that any organisation, which is really a bunch of people working towards a common cause, are really a bunch of people having many, many conversations every single day. So organisations are really a series of conversations. These conversations go in the boardroom, they go on in the lunchroom, they go on in private, they go on in public, they go on outdoors, they go on indoors, they go on in the toilet, they go on in the car, they go on by email, they go on by text, they go on and on and on. So we have many conversations every day with people. But the question that I would like you to consider is, are good quality conversations sadly neglected? In other words, just because we are interacting with people using a variety of medium every day, does that actually mean that they're quality conversations? I think the answer to that is probably no, or not as good as they could be. The majority of our conversations, of course, are task focused. That is about getting the goods or services out the door and maintaining that relationship with the customer. Now, of course, you've got to do that because obviously that's what you get paid to do. But I would say that the relationship related or relationship focused conversations are sadly neglected. And I would also say that they're the ones that make the big difference. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment as well. Now, lots and lots of people talk about the art of conversation, that as if there's some great art form in having a conversation. There isn't. Let me demystify that immediately. Each of you and me has many conversations every single day in a variety of different ways with a number of different people about all sorts of topics. We are well versed in having conversations. We practice it every single day. So to suggest that it's some sort of an art form is absolutely nonsense. And of course, if we imply that it is an art form, then it's kind of a convenient way for us to say, you know what, I'm not very good at art, so what I'll do is I will opt out of becoming good at conversations because it's a real aptitude that I basically don't have. Now, I would say to you this, that it's quite possible that there are some very difficult conversations that require a high skill level. There's no doubt about that. The difficult conversations around performance, for example, do require a degree of skill. There is no question about that. But giving people positive feedback, talking about their progress, delegating or coaching, they are not art forms. They're not that difficult as in conversations. So I think let's demystify this. There is no art to conversations. Okay. So I guess I'm posing the question here, are we losing the need for conversations in our technologically advanced society? I mean, if you came to work today on a bus or a train or a city cat or whatever you came to work on, if it's public transport, I want you to try something interesting this afternoon or this evening. I want you to get on board, grab your seat, put away your phone, put away your iPad, and just watch. Have a look around at the people on the boat or the bus or the train, and I'll guarantee that you'll see people with their heads buried into a screen somehow. And then when they get home, all of these people will bury themselves in another screen called a television, all the while, of course, making updates on their Facebook account. So we are living in a world where we are completely mesmerized by the screen. So it is interesting, isn't it, to know whether or not we are losing sight of the need to have the good old conversation. And of course, a lot of those conversations we do via technology as well. So I just posed that question for you. But I would also say to you that there is no substitute for the old-fashioned conversation face to face or over the phone or even via teleconference. There's no substitute. So I had a person the other day, a client of mine, who said to me, I like your idea, Tim, about conversations. I really do. But I must say, we don't have time for conversations here in our business, which I found to be quite an amusing comment. So the implication, of course, was that, conversations, one, take time, and two, that they're probably not as important as some of the other things that we do. So if you don't have time for conversations, then I'm afraid you probably don't have time for business, because conversations are absolutely critical to success. Kuzner and Posner, who wrote a great book called Credibility, make an outstanding statement. And they say that leadership is a relationship. And I love that. Leadership is a relationship. So if leadership is a relationship, in other words, you can't lead anyone unless you've got a trusting, working relationship with them. If they argue that leadership is a relationship, then my argument would be to them, how do you have a relationship? And the answer, of course, to that is, you guessed it, one conversation at a time. Over and over, building trust, building commitment, building understanding. It happens one conversation at a time. So there's a few things to think about when I talk about it all being part of the conversation, because really that's what I'm on about during this module. I'm wanting you to have more purposeful, meaningful conversations. And I don't want you to have what is commonly referred to in the literature as dehydrated conversations, which are just conversations about nothing that don't make any sense at all. They're very shallow and superficial. Now, in order to do that, there are a number of barriers that you and I have got to overcome. And we have to overcome these barriers. And let's have a look at some of the barriers, because these barriers are very real. Now, I put 9 down here. There may well be more than 9, but here are 9 that I think will get in the way of you having a really decent conversation with people. And they're not necessarily in any order either, but they're just barriers that I'd like you to think about. Barrier number 1, the inattention during conversations. This is the barrier where you're doing what we often refer to as multitasking, while you're, typing out an email while somebody's at the door wanting your attention, and you turn to that person and say, keep talking, I'm listening, I've just got to get this email out the door, and so keep going, I am listening. And of course, all under the guise that you're multitasking. But folks, the truth of the matter is, despite what you might think and your good intent, is that you're not doing much good with the email, and the other person standing at the door obviously believes that that email is more important to you than they are. So you're behind the eight ball before you start, and your quality of your email will be poor, and your interaction with the other person is probably not going to be anywhere near where it needs to be. So my suggestion is give people full attention. Now, if you can't, for example, get back to the email suggestion, if you're typing out an email, someone comes to you, wants your attention, and it's really important you get this email out, then just say to the person, look, I really can't talk at the moment. I have to get this thing out, but as soon as I've finished it, I'll come over and have a chat to you. And then, of course, do it. So that's important. But this whole idea of multitasking is being debunked. The research shows very clearly that our brain simply can't cope with two or more activities at the same time to the same extent that we're doing justice to them all. So that's the first barrier. So just give people 100% attention, or at least be assertive enough to let them know when you can give them 100% attention. All right, another barrier in communication and in conversations is restricted information channels. I'm not sure whether you say this at work, but I've heard it regularly, and this is the saying: no news is good news. So in other words, if you don't hear from me, everything's fine. Or you'll get told on a need-to-know basis. Now, these have been around for decades, and managers will justify restricted information channels on the basis that they, it's quite appropriate to do that. Now, the problem with restricted information channels, of course, is that if you don't tell people, or you don't keep people informed, or you don't find out where they're at in relation to what they're doing, then what happens, of course, is that you make assumptions about that. And of course, those assumptions are often inaccurate or untrue. And it means that basically people will be working on false information, which they really believe to be true information. So my suggestion to you is let people know your expectations of them. I had a situation where somebody was not giving any feedback on performance in the workplace, and I confronted them about it. I said, it's a good idea to be able to give people some feedback. And they said, oh, I couldn't do that, Tim. And I said, why not? And they said, because if I give that person feedback, I've got to give everyone feedback. Yeah, I was speechless. Some people don't get it. And of course, restricted information channels are not a good way to go. So talk to people, let people know. And if you don't know, let them know you don't know. Just say, I don't know the answer to that, but what I'll do is I'll try and find it out for you by talking to my boss, and if I've got something useful to tell you, I will certainly tell you at our next meeting. Another barrier, if you like, and obviously this is one of the reasons that we touched very much on Module 1, is the lack of feedback. And we're just not very good at feedback. When I say we, and I think everyone in this webinar is Australian, Australians are very poor at giving feedback. In fact, many would say we're the worst in the world. Some research demonstrates that. And, we can hypothesize about why we think that's the case. But nevertheless, we don't give enough feedback. Now, remember, we've done a whole unit on this. Positive feedback, negative feedback, any feedback. We need to be doing this more relentlessly, because if we don't, then our people aren't mind readers. How will they know what's expected of them? How will they know what they're supposed to be doing. Of course it'll be problematic for them. So, that's why I kicked off this whole Lunch and Learn with a module on feedback. It's so critically important. So if you've dropped the ball on that, go back and pick it up again and run with it. Now, one of the issues for conversations and communication generally is that you have probably been trained to answer questions. So you've probably got a technical expertise, you might have a trade, or you might have a degree. Whatever you have, you've got some specialised learning which has basically trained you to answer questions. In other words, when someone gives you a problem, you have a ready solution for that. The problem is, as a leader, you need to unlearn that. So leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. So your job now is not to answer questions when someone comes to you with a dilemma, but rather to get them to respond to their own question. Why? Because we want people to bring their brains to work with them, not to leave them at a paper bag at the doorway. We want people to think. And the only way we can get them to think is if we make them responsible and accountable for their learning, and that's done via questions. But your socialisation from birth has been around answering questions. So, grandma asked you a question, and you're only a little girl or little boy, and you ignore grandma, or you don't answer. You get a clip under the ear from mum and dad, and mum and dad says always answer grandma when she asks you a question. You get to school, same deal. The teacher is expecting you to answer the questions, and your supervisor is asking you questions. So by the time you become a leader, it's very hard to change this behaviour around responding to questions. But if you want to know one of the real ways of being able to have a conversation with people, it's the easy way, and the best way is ask them questions and sit back and listen to what they have to say. It's a good way to go. Barrier number 5, which will be up on the screen very shortly, no doubt. Barrier number 5 is too much formality, and what I mean by that is often these meetings that we have, these conversations we have with people are often done behind closed doors in your office. And obviously, if you do something in your office or in an area that's pretty much designated as your area, it's highly likely that it won't go as well. And why won't it go well? Because the person's probably feeling a little bit on edge sitting in your space, even though, of course, you're probably quite relaxed. They're probably quite nervous about it all, wondering what all this is about. So the formality means that the very best places to have conversations with your team members is away from the workplace. So go and have a coffee if you're a coffee drinker, even if you're not, it doesn't matter. Go away and have a coffee with someone in a coffee shop, and you will find that they will be, without doubt, the very best conversations that you've had with that person. So get rid of the formality, get off site, and really try and connect with people will make all the difference in the world. Okay, barrier number 6, and this one, of course, just has to come up, of course. How could we go any longer without talking about an over-reliance of email? Now, I can tell you for sure that the average person across 21 industries spends 2 hours on email a day. Now, some of you, of course, will spend longer than 2 hours a day on email. That's average. So in other words, over the course of 5 days, that's 10 hours spent on email. That in itself is not problematic. In fact, we could argue you can get a lot of really useful stuff done online. But I would also be willing to suggest to you and your team that I reckon a lot of that email could be done face-to-face in conversation. So the rule of thumb is if you're having a conversation via email, it should be done via face-to-face or over the phone. If you're waiting for their answer and you're responding back and forward, pick up the blower and have a conversation with them. You'll get more done, you'll get it done quicker, you'll feel better about yourself, and then you can delete the email. So I think sometimes we miss and forget how powerful our conversations can be. But please don't rely on emails to be having conversations. They're not good. And the reason they're not good is that they are asynchronous. And what I mean by asynchronous means that when you send someone an email, they respond to you when they're ready to respond to you. So you don't get an immediate answer, even though you may want one. So that can be problematic. And then, of course, when they respond, you don't necessarily respond back immediately. So that in itself creates problems. So isn't it just easier to get on the phone or go and have a chat to them and just sort of resolve it right there? I think so. Barrier number 7, lack of role models. Now, if your executive team, now I'm not sure where you sit in the pecking order, but I can say this, that if your executive team are not having good, transparent, regular conversations with each other, I can be doubly sure that your organisation will not be having conversations either, because people take their lead from their leaders. For example, if your leadership team, your executive leadership team is having conversations all the time between closed doors, with fingers pointing at slamming of desks, with slamming of doors, then I can assure you that sort of example will reverberate around the organisation. So, I mean, there may not be anything you can do about this, but I'm just making the point that if people said to me, we want to create a conversation culture in our workplace, where should we start? My answer to that would be start at the top. Because if people aren't modelling the behaviour at the top, then nothing else matters. So it's really, really important that your leaders are doing the right thing. Now, one of the typical reasons that we don't talk about things in the workplace is that we're scared of emotion. Isn't that funny how we're scared of emotion? We don't want to open a can of worms. We want to let sleeping dogs lie. So what I'll do is I won't bring it up because all it'll do is cause World War III. And of course, what we're doing as well is we're hoping that magically, whatever the issue is, it will go away. And I can assure you it will not go away. You have to actually have a conversation. And for you and me to preempt that the other person is going to be emotional in the conversation is also a little bit presumptuous, because let them decide how they want to react in the conversation. Our job is simply to do what we need to do, which of course is to have that conversation. And then they will decide whether they want to be emotional about it. And that's their choice and that's their decision. But at the end of the day, if that's stopping us, in other words, anticipating a negative reaction or emotion from other people, then that's not good enough, because people are actually holding us to ransom. And we call it emotional ransom. So have the conversation and don't allow the fear of emotion to get in the way. It's very interesting that we say to people, leave your problems at home. Don't bring your emotions to work. Think with your head, not your heart. All of these cliches that we hear every day, but the truth of the matter is we do think with our heart. We do get emotional about things. We do get upset and so forth, and we can't switch that stuff off. So just get on with it and have the conversations with people. And sometimes it'll actually be quite good to get it all out on the table anyway. Now, I think it's very interesting that one of the barriers to organisational conversations is office layout. Now, you might know that, of course, we've moved towards an open office plan. Most organisations are now working in an open office plan. There's a couple of good reasons for that. A very practical reason, of course, is it's cheaper because we can take less square metres space by having rows of people working side by side in alcoves. That's one reason. Another reason is that what we're trying to do is to open up the opportunity for people to talk to each other. Now, that's actually backfired a little bit. And have a think about your own workplace. People are now acutely aware that when they have a conversation with the person next to them in an open office environment, that conversation will be heard by as many as 20 to 30 other people. Now, if they lower their voice, then everybody, of course, is thinking there must be something sinister they're talking about. Um, by the time you get up out of your seat and go and find a room, you find that you've got to go through a rigmarole of organising a room. That can be problematic. So I'm not convinced that open office environments are actually very conducive to opening up the conversation approach. So, you might want to think that one through, not that you necessarily might be able to do much about it, but I think it's interesting to contemplate that open office doesn't really mean open communication. Okay, so they're the 9 things that I wanted you to focus on, and I think it's really important that you be mindful of those 9 and try as much as you can not to demonstrate any of those behaviours, because if you do, you're minimising your potential to be effective in a conversation. So what you've got on your screen here in front of you, it's just gone, there it is now, is a process called the 5 Conversations Framework. So this is something that I put together, which I wrote a book called The End of the Performance Review, and the subtitle was A New Approach to Appraising Employees' Performance. Now, my feeling at the time, and this was a couple of years ago, was that performance reviews are not working, they're not effective, and you've probably heard me talk about that anyway. And I thought there must be a better way. So what you're seeing in front of you right now is what I consider to be a better way. And since I bought that book out, it's still selling like hotcakes, which is great. But since that book came out, of course, there's been this huge movement away from performance review. So I was sort of ahead of the curve a little bit there. But you may say to me, well, we can't get rid of our conversations at Framework at Work because it's just one of the things we do. Fine. But what could you do to enable a better performance review? And so you can use the 5 Conversations Framework as a means of having a better quality end result in terms of performance. So either way, I would encourage you to use these 5 conversations embedded in this framework. So I'm just going to explain to you a little bit about how it works. And then what I suggest to you is to have a little bit of practice at this and implement this in an informal way. Or if you want to do it more formally, of course, and you've got the authority to do that, go ahead and do that. And if you want to talk to me about implementing it, I'm happy to talk to you about that as well. So let's look at each of the 5 conversations. And perhaps about what I can do is explain to you why I've picked those conversations and what they're trying to achieve. So you'll notice that on the left-hand side, you've got the months. So the argument is that we'll be having one short, sharp conversation per month over a 5-month period. Now, I can say to you that these conversations are designed to last for no more than 20 minutes. Now, if they last longer, it's because of personal choice or because you've gone off on a tangent or they've gone off on a tangent or that you just genuinely want to know where people are going and you're quite happy to spend the hour with the person. But they are designed to be 20 minutes, and there's a good reason for that, is that I don't want to deter people from doing what they should be doing, which is having regular conversations. So the topic column shows you the head topic of the conversation. So month 1 is a climate review. Month 2 is strengths and talents. Month 3 is opportunities for growth, followed by learning and development and innovation and continuous improvement. So each of those conversations occur. So we might start, say, in March, and conversation 1 happens in March. Conversation 2 happens in April. Conversation 3 happens in May, and so forth and so on. I would actually argue that anyone, and this has been implemented all over the world in all sorts of organisations, both public and private, I would actually argue that you should be very much doing 2 rounds of the 5 conversations every year. So that's not too big an ask. That's 10, 15 to 20-minute conversations with every person in your team over the course of the year. I don't think that's too much of an ask. Um, and of course, other people do, but then I'd be arguing, well, what's your priority? And if your priority is get the very best from the people that you work with, you really can't afford not to have a series of developmental conversations with the people that you lead, and that's exactly what this is. So you can notice in the content column, we've got some of the topics that we'll be covering. And over on the right-hand side, you can see some of the key questions that are being asked. So the climate review conversation is very much focused on job satisfaction, communication, and morale. So the very first question that could be asked in that, and of course I can send you some more information if you're interested, but the very first question that's asked is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 is high, 1 is low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? That's the question. Now, that person might say 6, or they might say 2, or they might say 8. Whatever they say is not the issue. You then ask them, well, why did you score it a 6 or a 2 or an 8? And you listen to what they say. And you listen to what they say, and then perhaps you then can say, is there anything that I can do personally that might help you improve your job satisfaction? So then we get on to morale and communication. So it's an easy conversation to have, and many organisations actually spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars a year doing climate review surveys or engagement surveys online. The information is collected. Everyone's fatigued about the whole notion of doing more and more surveys online. The information gets discussed at senior level and it gets shelved, and everyone just gets more and more cynical, and the next year round the participation rate drops off. Well, why don't we just do that in conversation? Why do we have to do the electronic version? Why don't we just ask people to sit down and talk about those things? You can even document those things, but we can talk about that at another time. In conversation 2, we sit down and we talk about people's strengths and talents. So instead of us going straight for the jugular and talking about what people are not good at, what about if we started with what people were good at? Wouldn't that be a good way to go? Everyone's good at something, and if you're racking your brains and thinking, well, Johnny and Mary, I just can't work out what their strengths are, then I'd suggest to you you definitely need to have a conversation with them, because they've got them. It's just that you haven't acknowledged or seen them. So you sit down and you have a conversation. Now, the whole purpose of conversation 2 is to establish some of the innate talents that your team members have and consider how those talents can be better utilised in their current or future work. Now, that's succession planning. So conversation 2 is really pretty much around your succession planning. So, we all know that there are sometimes there's square pegs in round holes. People have got jobs that they really aren't suited to, and it may be very, very hard for you as the leader to be able to change things to allow them to facilitate their strengths. But there's always the possibility of having that conversation and looking for opportunities in the future. In month 3, we have opportunities for growth. These are the areas where people need to pick up their standards and pick up their skill sets. And of course, if we're going to talk about strengths, we've got to talk about weaknesses as well. And we're going to, and of course, of the 5 conversations, this is probably the most challenging conversation because nobody really likes to talk about it. But it's critically important. So we have a conversation around opportunities for growth. Right. Now, out of those 2 conversations, 2 and 3, you have created a whole lot of learning opportunities, no doubt. And by learning opportunities, I'm not necessarily meaning sending people off to courses and so forth, but it might be coaching or mentoring or explaining how something is done. Nevertheless, conversation number 4 is a learning and development conversation. So what are some of the things that we picked up in the last 2 conversations that we could perhaps apply and do immediately? And conversation 5 is really about innovation and continuous improvement. Now, this is really the process where, you know, the difference between 4 and 5 is this. 4 is around themselves, their own learning and development, whereas conversation 5 is around the workplace. So this is around getting people to think of ways and means of improving the efficiency and effectiveness of their working place. People are still struggling to get people to bring their brains to work and be innovative. Well, here's an opportunity. How about we have a conversation about it? That's a good start. And you ask people to come to those conversations prepared. And I think it's very exciting, depending on the size of your organisation, to think that during this month, whatever it is, February, we're having an innovation and continuous improvement conversation right across the organisation. Now, what will happen is there'll be a whole series of really good things that'll come out of that. Practical, simple to implement, cost-effective ideas. Not many, but enough. And then, of course, you can implement those. So there's the 5 conversations. That's a framework that I think you may find very useful. So, guys, if you've got any questions, comments, observations, if any of you are using my 5 conversations framework, I'd be very interested in hearing what sort of feedback you're getting from you know, the people that you're having the conversations with. So how about you make a commitment to have a regular catch up once a month if you're not already doing it with your team members. Now I know each day you meet in the hallway and you've got this to work on and that to work on, and these are all very much what we call task-related conversations that naturally have to go on every day. I'm not talking about those conversations. I'm talking about the developmental conversations around people's growth opportunities and their developmental needs. And so the 5 conversations have been set up to meet those needs. So this is your opportunity of being able to create a framework around that might be very helpful for you. All right, so if there are no questions, I've got another couple of conversations for you that might be very useful. And one of those conversations, let me run through these. So here's 5 more developmental conversations. Now, you're saying, boy, you're throwing a lot of conversations at me. You don't have to use them all. But I mean, it's just giving you ideas so that you can start to have those. Because if you don't get that human connection with people, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And you can be the best motivator in the world. You can have the best technical skills. You can have the best, you know, you can have the interests of people at heart and all of this sort of thing. But if you don't genuinely connect with the people you lead, trust me, you will not get the best out of the people you lead. So it's really important that happens. Okay, just want to make sure the sound's okay. It just sounds like I might have, am I still, can anyone just indicate to me, can you hear me? Ah, good, thank you. I was just worried about that. So, okay. So here are the 5 conversations. Here are 5 more conversations. One of them is a coaching conversation. So sitting down with somebody and actually coaching them is an actual conversation. It shouldn't be you sitting there giving people orders and directives and barking out a way forward. You should be working closely with the other, unless it's pretty basic. But you should sit down and coach people through a conversation. Ask them questions. What are their ideas? How do they might go about what they're doing? So that's a good conversation to have. The mentoring conversation is a good conversation, and I suspect that some of you in your organisations have got mentoring programs. One of the reasons that mentoring programs don't really work, incidentally, is that, you know, it's too structured. You know, I'm going to force you to be my mentor. I'm going to force you to be my mentee. It doesn't work very well for those reasons because, you know, you're sort of sitting there thinking, I don't want that person to be my mentor. I want to choose my, so there's that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, if somebody informally wants to be mentored by you, then I think it's a wonderful thing. I still mentor people regularly in my industry every year, and I do it free of charge because it gives me a great deal of satisfaction to be able to pass on some of the wisdom that I've been able to gain over the years, and people get a lot out of it. What about the delegation conversation? Instead of just barking out a series of instructions to people, the delegation conversation, unless it's go for delegation, the delegation conversation is really a conversation, or should be. That's where you're tossing around ways and means of moving forward on something. What are my responsibilities? What are some of the things that I've got to consider? What are the resources? What's my delegated authority, and so forth? So that can be a conversation. What about the visioning conversation? Or this is the why of work that Dave Ulrich talks about. Great title for a book, and what Simon Sinek talks about. We should be spending more time with people explaining the context, the why we're asking people to do things. So people don't automatically know when you give somebody a task to do, they don't automatically understand the big picture. And this is a big trap for all of us in leadership roles. We need to explain to people the context. We need to explain to people what needs to take place, or how this is going to impact performance. So, very simple example, you ask someone to sweep the floor in the production area, and you mention to those people that you've got and of course that person's sitting there not terribly motivated, because who wants to sweep the floor of the production area at the end of a shift when they've got to go home after a long shift? So you explain this to them in the context of saying that there's a customer that's coming in to inspect the production area this evening, and this customer's thinking of moving all of their business to us, but they just want to make sure and feel confident that they're doing the right thing. And I just feel that if we make our production area as tidy as we possibly can, then we may be in a better frame of mind to be able to get this customer's business, and you have a role to play in that. Okay, they're not going to be super excited still, but at least they understand why. So visioning conversation is the why. 2 reasons managers don't do it. One reason is they think others already know it, and secondly, they think it's a waste of time. Both of those accounts are erroneous. And the 5th conversation that's critically important, I think, is the encouraging conversation. I know you're bulletproof. I know you don't need encouragement. I'm being a bit facetious here. But look, whether you need it or not is pretty much irrelevant. This is about others. So your team members actually need you to encourage them. So catch people doing it right. Sit down with people and let them know that you've got 100% confidence in their capacity to do a particular job, and let them know that you wouldn't have delegated it to them otherwise. Don't underestimate the power of the encouraging conversation. Really important. And 2 things before I finish up. Try and get yourself into what we call third position. Let me just quickly give you an overview. I'm conscious of time. First position, when you're looking at things through your eyes, so you see 2 people having an argument, normally they're defending their position. So they're really in a position where they're defending their position because they're only looking at things through the perspective of themselves. Second position is where I can put myself in the shoes of the other person. That's a superior position. So this is where I'm genuinely interested in why the other person thinks the way they do. Much better position. But I would challenge you that there's a even better position. That's what we call third position. This is where not only do I know what my position is, I also know what the other person's position is. But in third position, I'm able to understand how this position, the dilemma, this issue is in context. so I can see where it fits in. I can see the trees for the forests and all of that kind of thing. So I get a much better framework. I have peripheral vision. So the superior positions here is second and third. So getting into third is really important if you can. And finally, and I've sort of made the comment a number of times during our session, during our session today, is you just need to ask lots and lots of good questions. I don't think it's about you giving answers. It's about you asking questions. And the questions to ask, of course, are why, what, where, who, how, and which. All of those questions, of course, require more than a yes or no. You start any question with a why, a how, what, where, who, and which. You're likely to get more than a one-word answer. And that's what you want. So get good at asking questions. And one of the best questions you can ask when you're with someone, say it's a customer or a client, or it might be someone for the first time you're meeting them, ask them. Just say, do you mind if I ask you a few questions so that I can get to understand yourself and your situation? Great question. Now that's a closed question and they're likely to say, no, go for your life. So you've now got a license to ask a bunch of questions. So it's a great question to ask. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions so that I understand the situation or your circumstances or whatever it is? So get good at asking questions would be one of the key things that I'm hoping that you'll take out of today's session. So summing up, we've talked about some barriers of conversation. We've given you a framework, which is called the 5 Conversations Framework. I've given you 5 more conversations to have with your team members and colleagues. And I think, as you could probably anticipate, this being the 3rd module, yes, indeed, we have some homework. So what I am proposing for you to do between now and the next fortnight is I'd like you to organise a regular get-together with your direct reports on a fortnightly or monthly basis, and to stick with it no matter what. Now, if you've already got it, well, of course, try some of the skills and strategies that I've given you today, but you'll be surprised at this small intervention and how much of a difference it'll make. And I don't want you to talk necessarily about, seeing this as a convenient vehicle to be able to talk about the goods or services that you're talking about at the time. This is an opportunity for you to connect and develop with the person in mind. So that's your homework. I wish you well with that, and I want you to have a real crack at it because you'll find it'll make an enormous difference. And I'm always interested in your feedback. So we're up to halfway through now, so it goes quickly, doesn't it? So we've got getting the very best from people. Now, I should make an announcement that I'm going to be away for Module 4. Obviously, I'm still going to run the lunch and learn. It just won't be at the established time, which was 12 midday Australian Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to have to move that probably earlier in the morning because I'm going to be on a flight at the time. So I will send you an email with all that information and let you know. So hopefully that won't be too disruptive for you. And even if you can't attend, you've got the recording coming your way and, of course, the slides, which you will get for this afternoon's session. So thanks, folks. I've enjoyed my time with you again today, and I wish you all the very best and have a good crack at that homework, and I'll see you in a fortnight. So thanks, guys. See you. Bye for now.